Welcome back, everybody. I'm really excited about this deep dive. Sometimes the most interesting stuff is hidden, like buried treasure, not just sitting out in the open in some textbook.
Yeah, I totally get that.
So today, we're cracking the code of Freemasonry. It's one of those topics that's always swirling with mystery, right? Secret handshakes, symbols, rituals. What's it all about?
Right.
Well, luckily, we've got a roadmap. This symbolical-masonry.pdf is like our decoder ring. Think of it as episode 157, The Hidden Temple, because that's exactly what we're doing, unlocking the symbols of Freemasonry.
Perfect title.
We're going to try to distill it down, the core meanings, the historical context.
Yeah, cut through the clutter.
Exactly. No need to get lost in the weeds.
Right. And we don't want to get bogged down in any biased interpretations either. Just present the facts and let our listeners make up their own minds.
Exactly. So where do we even begin with all this Masonic symbolism? It's like a whole secret language.
Well, the document starts with a fascinating historical overview. And it points to, some pretty unexpected connections. Like, did you know there were organizations in ancient Rome that were, in some ways, like the prototypes for Masonic lodges?
Really? Like what, togas and secret handshakes?
Not quite togas, but they were called collegia, and they were basically trade guilds. But they also had these social aspects, like meeting places. They actually called them lodge rooms. And they offered benefits to members, even acted as burial societies. They had constitutions, sets of rules, pretty sophisticated, actually.
Wow, so they had that sense of brotherhood and mutual support that's so central to Freemasonry.
Exactly. And there's a theory mentioned in the text that these collegias eventually came under the control of the Roman government. A bit of foreshadowing there, perhaps, of how power dynamics can sometimes influence these organizations.
Interesting. So from these ancient Roman collegia, where does the trail lead? How do we get to the Freemasons we know today?
That's where things get really interesting. The text delves into this idea called the Comacene theory.
Okay, Comacene theory.
It's named after the Comacene masters, these highly skilled builders in the Middle Ages. The theory, championed by figures like Leader Scott, suggests that these builders organized themselves into lodges that functioned in a remarkably similar way to Masonic lodges centuries later.
So like the original stonemasons guilds.
Exactly. They had their own officials, specific meeting places, rituals, ceremonies, even secret passwords and signs to recognize each other. And most importantly, they fiercely guarded their trade secrets.
Yeah, those secrets of building those incredible Gothic cathedrals, that must have been powerful knowledge to possess.
Absolutely. But like any good historical mystery, there's a twist. Not everyone buys into the Comacene theory.
Really?
Yeah. R.F. Gould, a prominent Masonic historian, was pretty skeptical. The text describes his view of the Comacene theory as a vision hanging in the air. Pretty evocative imagery, right?
I like that. So is this Comacene theory just a nice story, or is there something to it?
Well, even if it's not entirely accurate, as the document points out, it's still a very important part of the conversation about Masonic origins. It highlights those enduring themes of skilled craftsmanship, secrecy, and brotherhood.
A piece of the puzzle, even if it doesn't quite fit perfectly. So, if not the Comacene masters, what's the more widely accepted story of how Freemasonry came about?
Most Masonic historians trace it back to those incredible Gothic cathedrals that began springing up all over Europe in the 12th century. Think about those towering structures, the intricate details. It was a whole new era of architecture.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing what those builders accomplished without modern technology.
Right. And to achieve that, they needed a high level of organization and skill. They formed guilds, the operative masons, and over time, those guilds developed a rich culture. Their tools and knowledge became more than just practical things. They were imbued with symbolic meaning, used to teach moral lessons and convey a deeper understanding of the universe.
So, like, building cathedrals was about more than just bricks and mortar.
Exactly. They saw their work as a reflection of divine order and harmony. And they had these traditional histories and regulations called ancient charges or ancient constitutions. The oldest one we have dates back to 1390.
1390, that's incredible.
Right. So it's like they're building these grand structures, these physical temples, but also laying the foundation for a symbolic temple, a system of moral and spiritual development.
That's a powerful image. But the text mentions a shift in the 15th century, something about cathedral building declining.
Yeah, you have the rise of Puritanism in England and civil wars, and these things led to a decrease in the demand for those massive cathedrals. So some of those operative guilds had to, adapt. They shifted to focusing more on domestic architecture, regular buildings, but they held on to their traditions and their organizational structure.
Keeping that thread alive. So we've got these skilled builders with their secret knowledge and traditions. How do we get from there to the Freemasonry we know today?
Well, here's where things take another fascinating turn. In the 17th century, we start to see the emergence of speculative masonry.
Speculative. Meaning what? More philosophical?
Exactly. People who weren't actually stonemasons started joining these lodges, drawn to the symbolism, the rituals, the idea of brotherhood. There's a record of a speculative lodge in London as early as 1631.
So it's becoming less about the literal craft of building and more about the symbolic meaning behind it.
Right. And a pivotal moment comes in 1646, when Elias Ashmole, this famous antiquarian, was initiated into a lodge that was mostly made up of these non-operative members. So it's clear that this shift was already well underway.
And from there, we see the formation of the Grand Lodge in 1717. What's so significant about that?
That was a key moment of reorganization. A guy named George Payne, he's a Grand Master at one point, took on the task of gathering and compiling all those old Gothic constitutions, trying to preserve the history and make it more unified. But it's interesting, the text also mentions that some manuscripts were actually burned. Scrupulous brothers were worried they might fall into the wrong hands.
Keeping the secrets safe. Classic Freemasonry. And then the Duke of Montagu becomes Grand Master in 1721, and things really take off.
Yeah, having a prominent figure like that leading the charge definitely helped popularize it.
Yeah.
And this is also the period when the system of degrees as we know it today really takes shape.
The degrees. So we're talking Entered Apprentice, Fellow Craft, Master Mason. How did that system come about?
Well, it evolved pretty quickly after the Grand Lodge was formed. At first, there was just a single first degree, but that got split into Entered Apprentice and Fellow Craft. And the third degree, Master Mason, was already there, but it got a major upgrade with a lot more symbolism and ritual added to it. By 1738, the 3 symbolic degrees were pretty much established in their current form. Oh, and I almost forgot. The text mentions William Preston, a prominent Mason who developed a series of lectures that helped shape the rituals as well.
Okay, so we've got the historical backdrop, the Roman guilds, the cathedral builders, the shift to speculative masonry, the Grand Lodge, and the degrees. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty, the symbols themselves. And the first step, of course, is the Entered Apprentice degree, this drama of beginnings, as the document calls it.
Yeah, it really is a dramatic moment. It's a symbolic rebirth. Think about it. You're leaving your old life behind, it's considered dead forever, and you're stepping into this new world, this brotherhood, with its own rules and traditions.
A fresh start. But it's not like anyone can just walk in and join, right? There's a vetting process.
Oh, absolutely. It's taken very seriously. The text talks about how in the past, most Masons knew each other personally. So when someone wanted to join, it was easy to vouch for their character.
Right. Small communities, everyone knows everyone.
Exactly. But these days, lodges are often in larger cities, communities are more spread out, and so it's not always so straightforward.
So how do they determine who's worthy?
Well, that's where investigating committees come in. When someone applies, the worshipful master will appoint a committee to look into their background, talk to people who know them, that sort of thing.
Like a background check.
Yeah, but focusing more on character. And some lodges use questionnaires as well, which, as the text points out, has been somewhat controversial. Some members feel like it's too impersonal, not in keeping with the traditions.
Makes sense. But I can also see why questionnaires would be useful in today's world. It's a way to gather consistent information, right?
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between respecting tradition and adapting to modern circumstances.
So after the investigation, there's the vote. And the text mentions that in American Freemasonry, they use a unanimous ballot. That's pretty high stakes.
It is. And there's definitely debate about whether it gives too much power to individuals. You know, one person could have a personal grudge or bias, and that could be enough to block someone from joining.
I can see that. The document mentions other systems, like the English system with its 3 black balls. It seems like they've tried different approaches over the years.
They have. The text also touches on the idea of a simple majority vote, or even a viva voce, which is basically an oral vote. But the key point is that the ballot in Freemasonry is more than just a formality. It's a judgment of character, a way to ensure that everyone who joins is truly fit to be a part of the brotherhood.
Maintaining the integrity of the group, which leads us to the qualifications themselves. The chapter is titled Worthy and Well Qualified. What does it actually mean to be worthy of joining Freemasonry?
Well, the text addresses the fact that Freemasonry has sometimes been criticized for being too exclusive. People saying the qualifications are too strict. But from a Masonic perspective, it's not about being elitist. It's about having a shared purpose, a commitment to something bigger than yourself.
Right. It's not just a social club.
Exactly. The text compares it to a well-run business or a church. They both have to be selective about who they let in to ensure that their mission can be carried out.
That makes sense. So what are some of the specific qualifications? What were the early Masons looking for?
The text points to one of the oldest Masonic documents we have, the Regis manuscript. It dates back to the late 1300s, and it lays out some basic requirements.
1300s. That's amazing that we even have something that old.
I know, right? It's a real glimpse into the past. So according to the Regis manuscript, an apprentice had to be of lawful blood, meaning born to married parents. And they had to have all their limbs intact, implying that they could handle the physical work. And crucially, they couldn't be a thief. They wanted to protect the reputation of the craft.
So basic honesty and a good work ethic, essentially.
Exactly. And the text points out that these early qualifications are echoed in Anderson's Constitution of 1723, which is considered a foundational document for many Grand Lodges even today.
So the core values have remained remarkably consistent. Okay, now let's talk about the initiation ceremony itself. One of the first things that happens is the hoodwink. What's the meaning behind that?
Well, it's more than just a blindfold. The text emphasizes the idea that true understanding requires inner preparation. It's not enough to just be physically present. You have to be mentally and spiritually ready to receive the teachings.
So the hoodwink symbolizes that initial state of blindness or ignorance.
Right. It represents the antisocial and unhuman spirit, as the document puts it. All those things that keep us from seeing clearly, from connecting with each other on a deeper level.
Kind of like a veil that needs to be lifted.
Exactly. And removing the hoodwink symbolizes the coming of light, the illumination of truth. It's a powerful image, and the text even draws a parallel to Jesus.
Jesus.
Yeah, not as the creator of truth, but as the revealer of it, the one who helped people see what was already there, like brotherhood, love, the idea of God as a universal father. Those truths existed before Jesus, but he helped people recognize them.
That's an interesting way to put it. Okay, so after the hoodwink comes the cable toe. What's the deal with that rope?
Well, it's a fascinating symbol with a long history. The text traces its use back to ancient times, in mystery religions, spiritual practices, even just for controlling animals. And in all those contexts, it's generally about control, obedience, direction.
Control and obedience. Those words can sound a bit harsh, especially in today's world.
I know, right? But it's important to understand them within the context of Masonic symbolism. And as the text points out, there are many different interpretations.
Like what?
Well, some Masons, like Albert Pike, believed it was primarily about physical control during the ceremony. But the text argues that it has a much deeper meaning, especially in the later degrees. Others, like Arthur Edward Waite, saw it as representing our bondage to ignorance, those things that keep us from reaching our full potential. And Lawrence, another Masonic scholar, viewed it as the mystic tie that binds us to God, the Masonic order, and principles of righteousness. Even Churchward, who was really into Egyptian symbolism, connected it to the idea of humanity's dependence on the divine.
So a lot of different layers of meaning.
Right. And the text uses this really interesting analogy to help explain it. It compares the cable toe to the role of law in society.
Okay.
Think about it. We're all bound by laws, whether we like it or not. But there's a big difference between someone who's forced to obey and someone who obeys willingly because they understand why the laws are there.
So like the difference between a prisoner and a free citizen.
Exactly. The text argues that true freedom isn't about having no restrictions at all. It's about choosing to follow the right path, even if you could choose otherwise.
Choosing to be guided by wisdom, not just by force. That makes a lot of sense. So after the cable toe, the candidate finally enters the lodge. What's the symbolism of that moment?
It's a really powerful moment. It's like being reborn. The text talks about how the candidate leaves behind all the trappings of the outside world, their social status, their material possessions, and they enter with just their naked and essential humanity. Their will, their mind, their heart. That's all they need.
Stripped bare, ready for transformation.
Exactly. And the text also presents this beautiful idea of the Mason as being on a quest for that which is lost.
A quest. I like that. What are they searching for?
Well, it's open to interpretation. It could be a lost secret or some ultimate truth, or maybe even a state of spiritual wholeness. The text uses this analogy from an old Gaelic poem about children searching for a lost song on a harp, representing that longing we all have for something deeper.
We're all trying to find that missing melody. That's something that will make our lives complete. And what does the text say about the ultimate aim of Masonry in this quest?
It talks about guiding individuals toward the secret of present eternal life.
Present eternal life.
Yeah, it's about finding that spark of the divine within ourselves, overcoming our lower desires, and living in accordance with a higher purpose. And it quotes Albert Pike's definition of Freemasonry, the subjugation of the human that is in man by the divine. Powerful stuff.
Definitely. So before we go any further, I have to ask about something that's always intrigued me. The invocation of deity in the ceremony. What's the role of prayer in Freemasonry?
Well, the text makes a simple but powerful point. Prayer has always been a part of human experience. Look at all the great figures throughout history. Many of them have been devoutly religious. So instead of trying to explain away the significance of prayer, we should acknowledge its place in our lives.
So it's seen as a natural expression of the human spirit.
Exactly. The text talks about how prayer expands our horizons, purifies our motives, disciplines our will. It's a way to connect with something larger than ourselves.
Okay, let's dive into some specific ritualistic actions. First up, circumambulation. That's the ceremonial walking around the lodge, right?
That's it. And it's a practice with incredibly ancient roots. The text mentions primitive peoples, the Greeks, the Romans, they called it dextroversum, and associated with purification. Hindus, Druids, early Christians. It's fascinating how this practice shows up in so many different cultures.
So walking in a circle has had spiritual significance for a long time. What does it symbolize in Freemasonry?
There are a couple of main interpretations. One sees it as an allegory for the soul's journey through life, constantly searching for that lost harmony. But the text highlights another interpretation that might be even more significant. Walking in harmony with the sun.
With the sun?
Yeah. The sun represents those natural powers and laws that govern the universe, and by moving in alignment with its course, the Masons symbolically aligns themselves with those forces. It's about understanding and cooperating with the natural order, and the text even suggests that this is the secret of human accomplishment.
So working with the universe, not against it. Makes sense. Next, the candidate is directed to approach the east. What's so special about the East in Masonic symbolism?
Well, the East has always been associated with light and the rising sun, and in many ancient cultures, the sun was worshipped as a god. But in Freemasonry, the East is occupied by the master of the lodge, not a literal sun.
So a symbolic shift.
Exactly. It's about moving from worshiping the sun literally to recognizing that same divine spark within ourselves.
So seeking the light within, not just in the external world. And the altar, what role does that play?
The text describes the altar as a sanctuary, a place of refuge. Historically, people seeking safety from persecution would sometimes take refuge in churches, and they'd grab hold of the horns of the altar for protection. It was a sacred space, inviolable.
Kind of like claiming asylum.
Yeah, exactly. And Masonry offers that same kind of sanctuary, not in a literal sense, but as a place of peace and support within the brotherhood. It's a reminder that even in the midst of the chaos of life, we can find that inner chamber of peace.
A refuge from the storms of life. Now, I know we have to be careful about revealing too much, but I'm curious about the obligation and the penalties that are mentioned in the text. They've always generated a lot of controversy, haven't they?
Yeah, there's definitely been some misunderstanding and sensationalism around that aspect of the ceremony. The text acknowledges that some of the language in the obligation can seem harsh or even violent, especially to modern ears.
Right, like talk of gruesome punishments and things like that.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that those things have to be understood in their historical context. The text mentions an article by Robert de Clegg in The Builder that delves into the historical background of those penalties. For example, in England, drowning was once a legal form of punishment for certain crimes. So when you see that kind of language in the obligation, it's not meant to be taken literally. It's about emphasizing the seriousness of the vows being taken.
A reminder of the weight of commitment. And the text also mentions that there's been debate within Freemasonry about modernizing the language of the obligation, making it more accessible to contemporary Masons.
There has. Some members feel like it's time to update the ritual, get rid of some of the archaic language and terms, but others argue that those elements are an important link to the past, and we shouldn't be too quick to discard them.
Finding that balance between preserving tradition and staying relevant, it's a challenge a lot of organizations face. Okay, let's move on to the three great lights. What are they and what do they represent?
So these are the first things the candidate sees after the hoodwink is removed: the Holy Bible, the square, and the compasses. They represent our duties to ourselves, to others, and to God.
3 fundamental pillars of a good life. Let's break it down. First, the Holy Bible. Why is it so central to Freemasonry?
Well, the text emphasizes its historical significance, how it's been compiled and translated over centuries, how it's had such a huge impact on cultures all over the world. In Freemasonry, it's seen as the ultimate symbol of God's will and wisdom.
So it's more than just a religious text. It's a symbol of something universal.
Right. It's about recognizing the divine in whatever form resonates with you. The text specifically cautions against bibliolatry, which is basically blind worship of the Bible. It's about taking inspiration from it, using it as a guide, but not getting stuck in dogma.
Seeking wisdom from various sources. Okay, what about the square? It's more than just a shape, isn't it?
Definitely. In the Blue Lodge, it actually has 3 symbolic roles. It's the emblem of the worshipful master, it's a working tool for the fellow craft, and it's one of the 3 great lights.
So its meaning depends on the context.
Right. As a great light, it's specifically a tri-square, used for testing right angles. The text points out that even in ancient cultures, the square was associated with uprightness and integrity. The Chinese call a person of good character a square man.
Living on the level, so to speak.
Exactly. And that's what the square represents as a great light. Moral uprightness, honesty, living a righteous life.
The cornerstone of a good character. And finally, we have the compasses.
Yeah, these play a key role in the 2nd and 3rd degrees, but as a great light, they're often interpreted in relation to the square.
Okay.
So in ancient times, people believed the earth was an oblong square and the heavens were circular. So the square came to represent the earthly, the material world, while the compasses, which draw circles, represent the heavenly, the divine. And on the altar, they symbolize that balance between our earthly and spiritual natures.
Striving for that perfect equilibrium. Along with the 3 great lights, there are the 3 lesser lights. What can you tell us about them?
Well, there are a couple of interpretations. One draws from Hermetic philosophy, suggesting that they represent the sun, the moon, and the master of the lodge, with the master symbolizing the complete human being, male and female aspects combined. The text calls it man-woman.
Interesting. So a blending of opposites.
Right. But there's also a more practical interpretation. Some believe they originated from the windows in operative lodges. Those lodges were often built against the south wall of a church, so the north side wouldn't have any windows.
Blocking out the darkness.
Exactly. So you'd have windows on the east, south, and west sides, and windows were referred to as lights. So it's possible that those literal windows evolved into the symbolic lesser lights.
From practical necessity to symbolic representation. Okay, let's talk about signs, tokens, and grips. What's the purpose of all that secrecy?
Well, the use of secret signs and words is a pretty common feature in secret societies throughout history. The text mentions Brother Gould's research suggesting that they've probably been around for a long time.
So a way to recognize fellow members and maintain secrecy.
Right. And tokens refer to specific signs or handshakes, grips, used for that purpose. It's like a secret code that only members know.
And the text argues that it's more than just ritualistic fun.
It is. The text frames it as a way for a hidden race among men to offer support and assistance discreetly, so they can help each other out without causing embarrassment or compromising someone's dignity.
A secret network of support. Makes sense. There's also a rite of salutation mentioned. What happens during that?
It's basically a formal way for the candidate to show respect to the officers of the lodge. But the text points out that it has a deeper significance as well. It's about the candidate recognizing the authority of the craft, the established order.
Okay.
And this ties into a bigger principle that Freemasonry has always upheld: the balance between individual liberty and the need for law and order. The text quotes Dr. J.F. Newton on this. Masonry has consistently championed freedom of thought and conscience, but it also recognizes that true freedom requires a framework, a set of principles to guide us.
Freedom within boundaries. I like that. Okay, let's talk about the apron. It seems like a simple piece of clothing, but I imagine it has a lot of symbolic meaning in Freemasonry.
It does, and the text debunks some of the wilder theories about its shape. Some people try to read all sorts of things into it, but its current form is mostly a matter of practicality.
So it's not a secret map or anything.
Not that we know of. The text stresses that we should focus on the meaning that's actually presented in the ritual. The ritual tells us that the apron is an inheritance from the past, a badge of a Mason, and an emblem of innocence and sacrifice.
Three distinct layers of meaning. Let's take them one at a time. What does it mean to say that the apron is an inheritance from the past?
Well, it's a direct link to the operative masons, the actual stonemasons who wore aprons as a practical part of their work.
Yeah.
And the speculative masons continued this tradition, but with a symbolic twist. Early Masonic aprons were much larger, sometimes made of leather, extending down to the ankles. But over time, they became smaller and more streamlined for convenience.
A symbolic connection to those who came before. And as a badge, what does it represent?
It represents the dignity of labor. Not just any labor, but work that's directed towards creation and building as opposed to destruction. The text highlights how society's view of work has changed over time. Manual labor especially was often looked down upon, but Masonry has always recognized the inherent worth of all honest work, whether it's physical or intellectual.
So it's about honoring the act of creation, the effort we put into making the world a better place, and finally, as an emblem of innocence and sacrifice.
This aspect is associated with the lambskin material that many Masonic aprons are made from. The lambskin is a symbol of purity and sacrifice, qualities that Masons are supposed to embody. But interestingly, the text also mentions that older lodges in Scotland used linen for their aprons, so it seems like the material wasn't always strictly lambskin in the earliest days.
So the symbolism evolved over time. Okay, we've talked about actions and symbols. Now let's get into some specific ritualistic practices and their meanings. First up, the removal of shoes. Why do candidates have to take off their shoes?
It's an ancient custom, a sign of reverence, especially when entering a sacred space. The text gives examples like the Pythagoreans, various ancient priesthoods, even Muslims taking off their shoes before entering a mosque. Mackey, the Masonic scholar, interprets it as a way to acknowledge the sacredness of the lodge. Shoes protect us from the dirt and impurities of the outside world, so removing them symbolizes entering a place of purity.
So it's about leaving behind the profanity of the outside world and entering a space of sacredness.
Right. But the text takes it a step further. It suggests that the ultimate goal isn't just to make the lodge building sacred, but to inspire Masons to live their lives in such a way that they make the whole world sacred.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. So walking through the world with reverence, treating every step as if we're on holy ground.
Exactly. It's a beautiful vision.
Another ritualistic action is the divestment of metals. What's that all about?
This one's rooted in ancient beliefs about astrology and alchemy. The idea was that planets influence human affairs, and that each planet is associated with a specific metal. So if you were wearing a certain metal, you'd be more susceptible to the influence of its corresponding planet.
So like wearing a lucky charm.
Yeah, sort of. But in this case, it's about removing those influences before entering a sacred space. You want to be free from any external forces that might distract you from the spiritual work you're about to do.
Makes sense. Okay, last ritualistic action we'll cover. The placement of the candidate in the northeast corner of the lodge. What's the significance of that location?
It ties into the ceremony of laying the cornerstone of a building. The cornerstone is the most important stone, the one that everything else is built upon. So symbolically, the apprentice in the northeast is seen as the cornerstone of the fraternity. They represent the potential and promise of youth, the foundation of the future.
The bedrock upon which everything else rests.
Exactly. But the text also mentions a darker side to this symbolism. In ancient times, it was common to bury a living being beneath the cornerstone as a sacrifice to appease the gods.
Whoa, that's a bit intense.
It is. But over time, that practice evolved into using effigies and then just placing valuables under the stone, like corn, wine, and oil, representing prosperity and nourishment.
Kind of like a time capsule.
Yeah, exactly. And Freemasons still do this today in a symbolic way, placing items of significance within cornerstones. So the apprentice in the northeast corner can also be seen as someone who's dedicating themselves to a higher purpose, offering themselves as a building block in this great temple of humanity.
A powerful commitment. Okay, what about the working tools of the entered apprentice? What are they and what do they represent?
The entered apprentice receives two working tools, the 24-inch gauge and the common gavel. The gauge is about time management, dividing our day into 3 equal parts: work, rest, and service to God and others.
A balanced life.
Exactly. And the common gavel is about removing vices, chipping away at those imperfections in our character, shaping ourselves into better people. The text mentions Carlyle and Bergson's ideas about tools defying what it means to be human, and it emphasizes how Masonry uses these tools not for literal building, but for inner transformation.
Tools for building our character. Okay, so the entered apprentice degree lays this foundation, this understanding of basic principles. What happens next? What does the fellow craft degree have in store?
Well, the term fellowcraft comes from the Scottish Masons, and the text references the Shaw statutes from the late 1500s, which provide some of the earliest details about how an apprentice would advance to this rank.
So we're going back even further in time.
We are. And it's interesting because back then, a master mason and a fellowcraft were basically the same thing. To become a master, you had to be accepted in the presence of other masters and apprentices, and they kept records of your name, your mark as a craftsman, who vouched for you, who your instructors were. It was very formal. And you had to submit an essay, a piece of your work to prove your skill.